They locked 78 children in for the night, checked every window, signed every journal, and went home. 8 hours later, every bed was perfectly made, every door was still locked from the inside, and 78 children had simply ceased to exist. No bodies, no footprints. The story begins in a place that was never meant to be frightening, a state orphanage on the edge of an ordinary town. From the outside, it looked like any other institutional building of its time. 3 floors of brick, paint peeling, a crooked metal fence, a playground that had not heard real laughter for a long time. Parents rarely came here, reporters nikigda. This was a house for children the world preferred not to think about. On paper, the final evening before the disappearance was routine. Dinner at 19 waf, roll call at 20 swas, lights out at 22 was. The kind of mechanical schedule that turns days into copies of each other. In the dining hall, the smell of watered-down soup and boiled pasta hung in the air. Metal spoons scraped enamel bowls. The younger kids fought over bread. The older ones traded jokes about which of them would escape first once they were old enough to be released into the real world. Staff records say there were 4 adults on duty, 2 educators responsible for the floors, 1 night nurse, and a security guard at the only entrance. The director had signed the end-of-day report and left the building shortly after 1930. His signature under that line will become one из ключевых деталей уголовного дела и одним из первых исчезнувших документов. Looking back, small details from that evening begin to glow like warning lights. One educator will later admit that the phones in the building suddenly stopped working after an afternoon inspection. The nurse will vaguely recall a technician from the ministry checking the fuse box, a man whose name cannot be found in any service log. Several children remember seeing a dark car idling outside the fence with its headlights off long after visiting hours were over. At the time, nobody connected these dots. Why should they? It was just another gray, tired day in a gray, tired institution. After dinner, the children drifted back to their dormitories. The smallest ones were helped into pajamas, scolded for running in the corridors, lined up for their evening medications. The nurse moved from room to room with a metal tray of paper cups. Officially, the pills were harmless. Vitamins, mild sedatives for the most anxious. In at least 2 later interviews, now-grown former residents swear that on that specific night, the tablets tasted different, more bitter, more chemical. One boy remembers spitting his out secretly into his sleeve. When investigators look for the medical journal that should list the medications for that date, they will discover that several pages from that month have been carefully cut out. In the oldest group, lights stayed on a little longer. Teenagers pretended to study, exchanged stories, wrote in notebooks they would never see again. One of them, the unofficial leader, teased the others about an unlocked emergency exit he claimed to have spotted earlier that day. An emergency exit that, by regulation, had to be locked with a chain and a seal. When 2 boys sneaked down to check, they found the door closed, the chain hanging loose, the state seal broken and lying on the floor. They joked nervously about using it to run away. Neither of them did. Later, during interrogations, they will contradict each other on whether they told an adult about it. At 21:30, the long, familiar ritual of bedtime rolled across the building like a slow wave. Educators walked the halls with clipboards, ticking names off lists. One of them remembers hearing the guard at the entrance, arguing quietly with someone on the intercom, then opening the door for just a moment. To this day, he cannot say whom he let in or out. The guard himself will insist under oath that no one entered the building after 20. When pressed, he will say the intercom was faulty that week, a statement impossible to confirm because the maintenance logs for that month will also go missing. The last person known to have seen all 78 children alive inside the orphanage was the nurse. Her shoes squeaked softly along the linoleum as she made her final round. She checked each dormitory, counted beds, adjusted windows, tucked in blankets. Some children pretended to be asleep, others clung to her, asking routine questions. Would there be visitors on Sunday? Would they get new shoes? Would they ever see their real families again? Years later, a handful of survivors will insist she looked different that night, more distracted, more distant, as if listening to something only she could hear. One girl remembers the nurse standing for a long moment in the doorway, silhouetted against the corridor light, before finally turning away. Another claims she heard the woman whisper, "I'm sorry," though she cannot be sure whether that memory is real or something her mind added later to make sense of the horror that followed. When investigators eventually track the nurse down in retirement, she will say the same phrase over and over. "It was a normal shift. I don't remember anything special. I went home. I slept. The next morning they called me and said the children were gone." At 22 Sake, the main lights went out. Only the dim emergency bulbs in the stairwells remained, bathing the walls in sickly yellow. Rain began to patter more insistently against the windows, erasing outside sounds. In the guard's logbook, the last entry for the night reads, 22:10. Building secure, doors locked, perimeter checked, no incidents. That line, more than any other, will later make investigators ask a question that no one has yet answered. How do 78 children leave a locked building without a single adult hearing it happen? The official version claims that nothing disturbed the night between 22 and 6 gas. No alarms were triggered. No neighbors reported screams or unusual traffic. No one called the police. But memory, especially the memory of children, tells a different story. One boy says he woke to the sound of heavy boots in the corridor, not the quiet slippers of the educators. Another recalls the sharp, chemical smell of something like hospital drifting into his room. A third remembers his door opening, a flashlight beam sweeping across the ceiling, and a low voice saying, "Not this one. Next." Are these precise recollections? Or are they trauma trying to fill in 8 missing hours with anything that resembles logic? In this film, the audience will have to hold both possibilities at once. The blank of the official record and the fractured, frightened testimony of those who were once small enough to fit into those iron beds. What is not in dispute is what the morning shift walked into. At 6, one of the educators arrived, shaking water from her coat, keyring clinking in her hand. She unlocked the heavy front door. The guard, pale from a coffeeless night, grumbled a greeting and slid the visitor log toward her. There were no unusual entries, no signatures except hers and his from the night before. Together they climbed the stairs, complaining about the rain, about their salaries, about the broken washing machine on the second floor. Ordinary words, spoken in the last ordinary seconds, before their lives became defined by one impossible scene. She opened the first dormitory door and froze. The beds were made with military precision. Blankets pulled tight, pillows fluffed, small slippers arranged in pairs on the floor. On each mattress, neatly folded, lay the children's clothes for the day. Shirts, dresses, socks, even belts. It looked like an inspection scene prepared for a photograph. Except there were no children. At first she thought it was a joke. Maybe the older kids had decided to scare her, hiding in the bathroom or behind the wardrobes. She called out their names, checked under beds, flung open cupboards. Nothing. The bathroom was empty. The windows were closed from the inside, latches still stiff with old paint. There was nowhere for 10 children to hide. Then she opened the next room, and the next, and the next. Same picture. Perfect order. No chaos, no overturned chairs, no broken glass. Just 78 empty beds in total, 78 sets of carefully folded clothes, 78 ghosts that the state would spend years trying and failing to explain away. By the time the director arrived, summoned by a shaking phone call, the building had already begun to feel wrong. Too quiet, too clean, as if someone had carefully erased the mess that children inevitably leave behind. The director's first words, according to one witness, were not, "Where are they?" but "Who else knows about this?" This is where Chapter 1 ends. On a corridor lined with open doors, the camera gliding past rows of untouched beds. No bodies, no blood. Just a silence so complete that it becomes its own kind of evidence, and a single unbearable question hanging in the air. What really happened in this building between lights out and dawn? And why did the records that could answer it start disappearing almost as fast as the children themselves? For the first few seconds, the educator who opened the dormitory door that morning simply could not understand what she was seeing. Her brain tried to correct the image, the straightened blankets, the folded clothes, the silent pillows. It felt like walking into a photograph staged for an inspection, not into a room that, 8 hours earlier, had been full of restless, breathing children. She called out the first name on her list. No answer. The second. The third. Her voice echoed strangely in the narrow room, hitting bare walls instead of sleepy groans. She strode between the beds, yanking blankets back as if a dozen kids could somehow be hiding under each one. Nothing. No toys forgotten under pillows, no socks on the floor, no half-open drawers. In an orphanage accustomed to noise and mess, the neatness of the room was the first truly terrifying thing. The guard joined her, breathless from the stairs. Together they repeated the ritual in the next dormitory, then in the one above. Everywhere they found the same unnatural order. Beds made, clothes laid out, shoes aligned, windows latched from the inside, floors swept. No overturned chairs, no broken glass, no muddy footprints. It was as if someone had carefully prepared the building for a visit from inspectors. then removed all the children like props from a stage. By the time the director arrived, summoned by a call that began with, "I think something is wrong," and ended in sobbing, the orphanage had already started to come apart. Staff wandered the corridors in shock, clinging to clipboards and coffee cups like life rafts. Someone checked the basement, more from instinct than logic. Someone else unlocked the attics, knowing in advance they would be empty. Every door that had been locked the night before remained locked. Every key was accounted for. The first reaction was denial. One educator suggested that the older boys had organized a mass escape and somehow persuaded the younger ones to join them. Another insisted that this was some kind of cruel prank. The director, sweating and red-faced, bellowed that children do not simply evaporate, then ordered everyone to search again. Bathrooms, laundry room, storage closets, under staircases, behind curtains. They obeyed, but the search already had the feeling of a ritual, an action performed for its own sake. Deep down, every adult in that building understood. If 78 children were hiding here, they would have been found in minutes. Only then did someone pick up the phone to call the authorities. The official version later would say the call was made at 06:15. Some staff insist it was closer to 7. The difference matters because in that gap lies nearly an hour in which panicked adults tried to decide what scared them more, the disappearance itself or the questions that would follow once they admitted it. At least one person argued that they should wait a little longer, maybe they come back. Another quietly suggested calling not the police, but our curator at the ministry first. When the first patrol car pulled up outside the rusted fence, the story of the orphanage stopped belonging to its staff and became part of something much bigger and much less interested in the truth. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, carrying notebooks already half full from other, simpler cases. Their faces changed as they listened to the director's explanation. Missing children, yes. 1 or 2 runaways, yes. But 78? Taken from locked rooms in a single night? It sounded like hysteria, not a report. They asked the obvious questions. Were the gates locked? Yes. Were there any signs of forced entry? No. Had anyone come or gone in the night? According to the guard, no. Had there been threats, custody disputes, anything that might explain a coordinated abduction? Nothing. These were children the world had already forgotten. The officers began with the physical evidence. They inspected locks, windows, fire exits. The main entrance door showed no scratches or damage. The emergency exit on the ground floor was closed, but as 2 boys had noticed the night before, the chain that should have bound it hung loose. The state wax seal lay on the floor, cracked neatly in half. To one officer, this looked like the obvious escape route. To the other, it looked uncomfortably precise, as if someone wanted it to be noticed. They checked the courtyard. Damp soil, no clear footprints, tire tracks near the gate, but the rain had smudged them into unhelpful scars. Neighbors, roused by sirens and shouting, gathered behind their curtains or at the fence. When questioned, most claimed they had slept through the night undisturbed. One night shift factory worker, however, insisted he had seen a dark truck near the orphanage around 3 in the morning. Lights off, engine idling, as if waiting for someone. At the time, he hadn't thought it important enough to report. Back inside, the officers moved to the dormitories. They wrote down bed numbers. They photographed the eerie neatness, a row of small pillows, identical blankets, each mattress labeled with a child's surname. Those photographs, taken more to satisfy protocol than with any expectation of later importance, would become some of the most disturbing images in the entire file. They look less like a crime scene and more like a military barracks waiting for soldiers who will never return. The staff were questioned next. The night nurse repeated her story. Pills, rounds, nothing strange, went home, slept. The educators described the usual bedtime chaos, and then nothing. The guard stuck to his logbook. He had locked the doors, walked the perimeter, seen and heard no one. When asked about the broken seal on the emergency exit, he shrugged. Must have been like that before. I didn't notice. The officers exchanged a look. That answer would go into the report, but not without a skeptical underline. One detail especially bothered the senior officer: the absence of noise. Removing or convincing 78 children to leave their beds should have produced shouting, crying, arguments, accidents. Yet no one had heard a struggle, a scream, even the slam of a door. It suggested either that the children had gone willingly, which seemed absurd, or that something had silenced them very quickly. Drugs, gas, a carefully orchestrated lie. None of those words made it into the first official document, but they had already formed silently in his mind. Soon, the orphanage filled with people who had never set foot in it before. Higher-ranking police, plainclothes men who did not introduce themselves, a doctor to assess the staff's condition, a representative from the regional education department, furious that such a scandal might break. Each arrival shifted the atmosphere from shock to something colder: control. Instructions were given not to talk to journalists, not to call relatives, not to speculate. Staff were reminded that their jobs, and in some cases, their freedom, depended on their cooperation. The investigation, at least on paper, intensified. Rooms were measured, vents examined, basements mapped, files were seized for safekeeping, personal records of the children, medical journals, visitor logs, staff schedules. Some of those folders would never return to the orphanage. Others would reappear months later, thin and incomplete, entire weeks missing as if somebody had taken scissors to the past. Outside, rumors spread faster than any official statement. Some said a criminal gang had taken the children to sell their organs. Others whispered about a secret train that had come in the night. A few, lowering their voices almost to nothing, suggested that people from above had needed healthy orphans for an experiment, a closed camp, a nameless facility far from any town. In the absence of facts, the human mind looks for patterns, even monstrous ones. By midday, the building had been transformed from a home into evidence. The children's drawings were still taped to the walls: clumsy houses, crooked suns, figures with stick-thin arms, but now they were seen through the lens of loss, relics of people who no longer existed in any verifiable way. Staff wandered between rooms they had walked through 1,000 times before, suddenly noticing details they had never registered: a camera that had not worked for months, a lock that always stuck unless you pulled it a certain way, a blind spot in the yard where the floodlight never reached. What makes that morning so chilling and so powerful for your film is not just the scale of the disappearance, but the way reality seemed to cooperate with it. No overturned desks, no blood, no broken hinges. Instead, a building arranged almost politely for the investigators, as if someone had said, "There, we've cleaned up. Now see if you can prove we were ever here at all." By the end of the first day, the case file already contained contradictions that would never be fully resolved. 2 timelines that didn't match, 2 different counts of how many staff had been on duty, conflicting statements about the car at the fence, the intercom argument, the exact time the phones stopped working. Officially, the case was registered as a mass disappearance. Unofficially, in the margins of notebooks and in whispered hallway conversations, a different word began to appear. They found the first clue in a trash bin that was supposed to be empty. It wasn't a weapon, or a note, or a map. It was a single torn page from the orphanage logbook, the page with last night's entries, ripped out so roughly that the ink from the missing lines still bled into the paper that remained. By the second day, the orphanage was no longer just a building. It was a maze of contradictions. Officially, the investigation was comprehensive. Every room photographed, every adult questioned, every document collected. Unofficially, small, stubborn pieces of reality kept refusing to fit into any sane version of events. The logbooks were the first problem. On a metal cart in the director's office, clerks stacked everything that looked like a record: attendance journals, medication schedules, visitor logs, phone call registers. From a distance, the piles looked comforting, neat, bureaucratic, complete. Up close, they were full of holes. The duty roster for that week had 2 different versions of the night shift. The medical journal skipped entire days with no explanation. The main attendance book showed 78 children present at evening roll call, and then simply stopped. No signature for the morning count, no corrections, no notes, just a blank where the next line should have begun. When one of the junior investigators flipped the book over to check if pages had been removed, he found the ragged stubs, a single sheet torn out near the bottom, fibers still clinging to the spine. Later, in the trash bin by the director's desk, someone else found part of that missing page, crumpled and stained with coffee. The upper half was gone, but the lower half still showed the beginning of a line. 22:30, unusual noi. And then nothing. The rest had been ripped away. The director claimed not to know how the page had been damaged. Perhaps, he suggested, the children had played with the books. Perhaps the staff had made a mistake. His answers sounded less like explanations and more like attempts to fill a silence with any words at all. The cameras were the next mystery. Like many state institutions, the orphanage had been fitted with security cameras for the protection of the children. One watched the main entrance, another the ground floor corridor, a third the yard, a fourth the stairwell. The monitors were old but functional, or so everyone thought. When technicians arrived to pull the recordings from the night of the disappearance, they discovered something that should have been impossible. Between 21:47 and 05:59, every channel showed the same thing: not static, not darkness. A frozen frame, the exact same still image on all cameras, An empty corridor, a closed door, a clock on the wall showing 21:46. The picture did not flicker, did not shift. It was as if time inside the wires had simply stopped. The security company swore that such a failure could not happen on its own. A total system freeze would normally reboot automatically. To hold a still image that long, someone would have had to intervene, to cut power in a specific way, or to replace the recording after the fact. Yet all physical seals on the metal recording box in the basement were intact. No tool marks, no broken locks. Officially, the report would later state that a technical malfunction resulted in the loss of footage. Unofficially, in the margins of one investigator's notebook, next to the word malfunction, someone had drawn a small question mark and 3 underlines. Then there were the testimonies, fragments of memory that refused to line up neatly. One cleaner, who worked early shifts, remembered arriving that morning to find the director in the corridor outside the office, white-faced and sweating, with a man in a dark suit she'd never seen before. According to her, the man's first instruction was not, "Search the building, but no one talks to the press. No one." When asked to identify him later, she could not. He was not listed among the officials who had officially visited the orphanage that week. The night shift guard at the factory across the street described seeing 2 silhouettes near the side entrance around 3 in the morning. He thought they were educators, stepping out to smoke, until he noticed the shape of something larger behind them. A truck or a van, hard to tell in the rain. He admitted he hadn't paid much attention at the time. "You don't assume," he said bitterly years later, "that someone is stealing an entire building full of kids." Inside the orphanage, the most troubling testimonies came from the few children who had not been there that night. 3 were in hospital: a broken arm, pneumonia, a scheduled operation. 2 more had been temporarily placed with relatives. All 5 told investigators variations of the same story. The orphanage was strange in the days before the disappearance. Adults whispered. Offices stayed lit late. One boy claimed he overheard the director on the phone saying, "If you're going to do it quickly, before the inspection." No recording of that call existed. The phone logs for that week contained more missing lines. The more the investigators dug, the more first clues appeared, and the more quickly they seemed to vanish. A teacher swore she had filled out a detailed incident report about the broken seal on the emergency exit door 2 weeks before the tragedy. She even remembered the exact phrase she used: "Access to the outside can be gained without staff knowledge." When the investigators asked to see the document, the filing cabinet where such reports were kept produced a folder with the correct label, but inside there were only 2 blank sheets and an empty paperclip. The nurse insisted that all medication logs were always signed in duplicate. Yet for the week of the disappearance, only a single set of signatures remained, and even those looked strangely uniform, as if written in a hurry on the same day. Forensic analysis would later suggest that several signatures, supposedly made by different people over several nights, were all written with the same pen and the same pressure within a very narrow time window. And then there was the phone call that officially never happened. A neighbor, an elderly woman whose window faced the orphanage gate, told a junior officer that she had been woken around 4 a.m. by the sound of the public phone on the corner ringing again and again. When she finally looked out, she saw a figure in a coat standing in the rain, shouting into the receiver, gesturing wildly toward the orphanage. Minutes later, a dark car arrived. The person from the phone got in. The car drove away. When the officer checked the records for that payphone, he found that all outgoing call logs from that night had been wiped due to a data retention error. Individually, each of these fragments could be dismissed as faulty memory, coincidence, or clerical sloppiness. Together, they formed something more dangerous: a pattern. A torn log page that mentioned unusual noise, cameras that froze only during the crucial window, reports and phone records disappearing selectively, official visitors who left no official trace. When the lead investigator tried to map all of this on a whiteboard, the resulting diagram looked less like a crime scene sketch and more like an anatomy of obstruction. For every piece of physical evidence that survived, there seemed to be another that had been removed, altered, or quietly downgraded to irrelevant. In your film, this chapter is where the tone shifts from pure mystery to suspicion. The camera can linger on small, tactile details: the fuzz of torn paper fibers under a magnifying glass, a VHS tape being ejected from an old recorder, label smeared, a stamp on a document reading "archived," slamming down over a paragraph that will never be shown to the audience. The narration doesn't need to accuse anyone directly. It only has to keep asking the same 2 questions. Who benefits when evidence goes missing? And how many accidents does it take before we stop calling them accidents? As days turned into weeks, the first wave of public attention faded. Newspapers moved on. Officials assured worried citizens that all measures are being taken. But inside the thin case file, the list of unexplained irregularities just kept growing. A nurse who wanted to change her testimony suddenly withdrew from cooperation, citing health reasons. A clerk who had hinted that there were 2 versions of the initial report was transferred to another region. A letter from a distant relative of one of the missing children, claiming to have seen the child alive in another institution, was logged and then misfiled so thoroughly that it resurfaced only decades later. The first sign that the investigation had changed hands was the silence, not the silence inside the empty dormitories. By now, the staff had grown tragically used to that, but the sudden, enforced quiet around the orphanage itself. Journalists who had been calling every hour stopped receiving updates. Parents and distant relatives of the missing children found their calls redirected, then ignored. Inside the building, conversations that had once been frantic and open dropped to whispers the moment a stranger in a suit walked by. They did not arrive in siren-blaring cars. They came in unmarked sedans, men and women in plain clothes, carrying folders without logos and identification cards that they flashed too quickly for anyone to read properly. They did not introduce themselves to the remaining staff as detectives or social workers. They simply said, "We're taking over now." From that moment, the investigation split in 2. On the surface, the local police continued to do what an investigation was supposed to do: re-interview witnesses, check nearby towns, compare lists of missing children. Their efforts were documented, logged, and eventually cited in short official statements summarizing the case as tragic but unresolved. Beneath that surface, a quieter process began. It was less about finding out what had happened than about deciding which parts of what had happened would be allowed to exist on paper. The new team set up in the director's office, pushing aside his framed certificates and family photographs. A large metal safe was brought in and bolted to the wall. One by one, all the most sensitive documents migrated into it: staff contracts, the children's files, previous inspection reports, letters from complaining relatives, internal memos about budget cuts and overcrowding. The explanation was simple: we must protect the integrity of the investigation. The effect was simpler still. No one could see anything without permission. Staff were called in individually for clarification interviews. These were different from the earlier, chaotic interrogations. Now the questions were carefully phrased, the tone at once polite and heavy. "Are you sure you remember it that way? Maybe you misheard the director on the phone. He was under stress. You understand that making unfounded accusations could have consequences, yes?" Some came out of these meetings pale and shaking. A few, previously talkative, became suddenly cautious. One educator who had mentioned seeing a black car at the fence now claimed she must have been mistaken. The cleaner who remembered the unknown man in the corridor began to doubt her own memory. "Maybe I saw him a different day. It all blurs together." There were, however, things that no amount of pressure could completely erase. A written complaint about malfunctioning cameras that had been filed weeks before the disappearance vanished from its usual folder, but a carbon copy, stamped by the post room, survived in a separate archive. A nurse's note about a strange change in medication taste for several children was quietly removed from the medical journal, but the page beneath it still showed the faint imprint of her handwriting pressed through from the missing sheet above. An incident report about the broken seal on the emergency exit, so vital to understanding how someone might have moved in and out unnoticed, was lost, then misfiled, then finally found, now rewritten in a softened form that described the problem as minor and fully resolved before the night in question. When the local investigators protested, they found themselves gradually sidelined. Invitations to case conferences stopped arriving. Their access to files was restricted pending review. One of them, more stubborn than the rest, kept his own private notebook, copying details from documents before they were taken away. Years later, that notebook would provide some of the only surviving traces of how much evidence had been quietly edited or removed. Outside the institution, the pressure spread. Parents and relatives of the missing children were called to closed-door meetings. They were offered official sympathy, sometimes money, occasionally hints of new leads that never materialized. At the same time, they were warned that spreading rumors or cooperating with foreign media could interfere with the investigation and harm the memory of the children. A few signed non-disclosure agreements they did not fully understand, hoping it would help bring the case to a conclusion faster. It didn't. Inside the orphanage, the staff learned new phrases. "You don't remember that. That's not relevant. That version is not to be repeated." A young social worker who insisted on writing a report about the psychological impact on the surviving children, those who had been in hospital or with relatives that night, was told that her paper contained unhelpful speculation and blocked from publication. Perhaps the clearest sign that this was no longer just an investigation, but an exercise in damage control came when the official narrative hardened. In the early days, the description of the case shifted constantly. Mass escape, possible organized abduction, unexplained disappearance. By the end of the first month, all public documents used a single phrasing: unresolved incident with no evidence of outside interference. That might have sounded neutral, but it carried a devastating implication. If there was no outside interference, perhaps no one was really to blame. Behind closed doors, however, the same authorities who spoke of no outside interference were ordering background checks on staff, monitoring phone calls, and sending quiet inquiries to distant institutions. Have any unregistered children arrived recently? Boys or girls of such and such ages, without papers? Those requests, too, left faint archival traces. In your film, this chapter is where the audience sees the machine at work. For decades, the official story about the orphanage ended with a single cold phrase: the whereabouts of the children remain unknown. The investigation was marked as unresolved, then quietly archived. But cases involving missing children age badly. They don't close, they ferment. Every few years, a new investigator would pull the file, flip through the same thin stack of reports, and put it back again, defeated by the same missing pages, the same broken timeline. What changed was not the past. What changed was access. In the years that followed, new laws opened certain archives that had been sealed for reasons of national security. Among them were records from distant institutions, hospitals, closed schools, so-called special facilities that had never appeared in the original investigation. One of the younger researchers assigned to digitalize old records noticed something odd: a cluster of admission forms from another region, all dated within a week of the orphanage disappearance, all for children listed as foundlings or transferred from unregistered institution, all with birth dates that matched several of the missing orphans exactly. The names on those forms were different. The files insisted these children had been abandoned anonymously or evacuated from areas no longer safe. Yet when the researcher cross-checked their medical histories, scars, illnesses, even rare allergies, with the surviving copies of the orphanage's files, too many details lined up. It was as if someone had picked up a group of children, shaken off their names, and dropped them into a new life with freshly typed identities. This discovery gave weight to the first of three main theories about what happened that night. Theory 1. Forced transfer. According to this version, the orphanage was not raided by criminals or outsiders, but emptied on orders. The motive? To supply another institution, perhaps a closed medical facility, a special education boarding school, or even a labor camp, with children who had no parents to ask questions and no one to file appeals. Changing their names erased the paper trail. Ripping out logbook pages and freezing cameras didn't just hide a crime, it hid a state-sanctioned reallocation of human beings. In this scenario, the roles of the adults in the orphanage become more complicated. Some may have cooperated knowingly, convinced that someone up there had decided it was necessary. Others, like the nurse who whispered, "I'm sorry," might have been trapped in a system where refusal meant losing everything, including their freedom. The silence that followed for years was not just fear of scandal. It was fear of admitting they had followed orders that destroyed lives. Theory 2 goes darker. It suggests that the children were not simply moved from one institution to another, but that a portion of them became part of a medical or military experiment, one of those projects that even regimes later prefer to pretend never existed. This idea comes from scattered references in unrelated files, budget lines for unidentified juvenile subjects, reports on behavioral adaptation in group environments, storage records for children's belongings labeled only by numbers. There is no single document that proves this. There is no photograph, no confession, no list with the orphanage's name on it. What fuels this theory is the pattern of what isn't there, the way entire batches of records vanish around the same dates, the way witnesses who mention special trains or visiting commissions suddenly retract their statements. For your film, this theory is less about stating a fact and more about showing how, in certain times and places, children without families were seen not as individuals, but as material that could be used and discarded. Theory 3 is the one that hurts the most because it doesn't offer a clean villain. It says that the disappearance was a chain reaction of negligence, greed, and cowardice. Perhaps a trafficking group did target the orphanage, bribing or blackmailing a few key staff. Perhaps the operation went wrong, some children dying in transit, others scattered. And those responsible realized that admitting the truth would destroy careers far beyond one institution. In this version, the cover-up grows layer by layer, not from a single mastermind, but from dozens of small decisions. A report softened here, a missing page there, a superior who says, "We will not put this on paper." Whichever theory the viewer leans toward, one fact remains. The system behaved as if the children's disappearance was not a tragedy to be solved, but a problem to be contained. So what, in the end, do we know? We know that at least a few survivors exist. Years later, adults with hazy memories of a childhood in some home have recognized the orphanage building in old photographs. One remembers being woken at night, lined up with other children, and told they were going to a better place. Another recalls being instructed to answer to a new name, punished when she slipped and used the old one. None of them can trace the journey exactly. Sedatives, fear, and the simple erosion of time have blurred the route, but their testimonies suggest movement, not murder. We know that attempts to get official recognition of their past have met resistance. When lawyers for one group of former wards requested access to their full childhood files, they received thin folders stamped with phrases like "data not preserved" and "record destroyed during reorganization." Yet other documents, financial reports, supply orders, survive without gaps for those same years. Paper, it seems, was not the problem. Choice was. And we know that the orphanage itself has changed. Today, the building might be something entirely different. An office, a warehouse, apartments. New paint covers old cracks. The dormitories are refurbished, the iron beds long gone. People pass by with groceries and headphones, unaware that the walls around them once held 78 lives that the state lost and then tried to lose again on paper. Once a year, a small group, relatives, activists, maybe a former investigator, leave flowers at the fence. There is no official plaque. Memorials require acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would mean answering questions that are still dangerous. For your final chapter, the power lies in how you frame these fragments. Instead of promising a neat solution, you let the audience sit with 3 uncomfortable truths. The children can disappear not only in the dark, but in broad daylight inside institutions. That systems meant to protect them can also erase them, and that sometimes the most important documents in a case are the ones missing from the file. The narration can end on a simple, quiet image. The camera moves through a modern archive, rows of boxes stretching into darkness. Labels: Education Ministry, 19. Health Department, 19. Closed institutions, 19. Somewhere, in one of those boxes, there may still be a misplaced report, a misfiled list, an original log page that escaped the shredder. One sheet of paper that could finally match names to numbers, faces to stories. Until it is found, the orphanage where 78 children disappeared in one night will remain a kind of haunted house in the country's memory. Not because of ghosts, but because of the questions it leaves behind. How many more files look just like this one? How many more children went missing not in forests or crowded stations, but in neat, well-run buildings with clean beds and perfect attendance reports? And how many of those stories are still sitting, silent and sealed, waiting for someone curious enough, or stubborn enough, to open the right box, on the right shelf, on the right day?